Welcome back, and thank you very much, Maria, for sharing your very personal mission statement and your process to developing your mission statement. Very much something else that leaders do is dig deep like that and make yourself vulnerable to share with folks and to connect and to empower folks to do things for themselves. So that is very much appreciated and something that we can all learn from, absolutely. We're going to spend the next hour talking about what changes for you as a leader and recognizing that we have with us, again, both people who aspire to leadership and management roles and people who spent significant time in leadership and management roles. Hopefully, this is an opportunity for those of you who've spent times in those roles to reflect on your own journey and to think about how you share your journey and connect with your new leaders to support them as they're navigating these changes. So the next slide has for us our agenda. The next slide actually has for us, sorry, Maria, if you can, thank you. Our agenda for the day, the change that is coming just ahead for you if you're aspiring to be a leader. And apologies, Maria, if you want to go back up to the first picture. Thank you. So I did want to actually spend just a quick moment before we got to the agenda talking about the why as well and the difference between leadership and management and share with you today some images. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to spend 6 weeks in Whistler last summer, and this particular image is at the pinnacle of a 10-kilometer hike on Whistler Mountain. It's an overlook to Chickamus Lake, and it's a trail that one would call intermediate. It has a bit of scrabbling and quite a rocky trail. And the person who was leading and guiding us through this process, here's the why we went through this hike, how she managed to convince a bunch of beginner hikers that this was something that was worth doing, something that we could do, is spend our day on this hike to see this beautiful view that you can't see otherwise. And then the next picture talks a little bit about how she operated as a manager in this particular process. So you can see again that it's not necessarily a beginner hike by any stretch. You can see the lake there in the background. And so as a leader, she talked to us about the vision, the beautiful day, the scenery, the accomplishment of it all. And then as a manager, she made sure we all got there safely. This is a part of the mountain that if you sprain an ankle, you've got to get yourself a certain amount of the way before somebody can come and rescue you. So the process was managed by talking to us about staying 6 feet apart so that if you start to fall, you don't grab a hold of somebody else and cause 2 injuries. It was about checking our backpacks and making sure that we had the water and the nourishment and the cover that we might need in the changeable mountainside. So then, thank you, Maria, we'll get to the agenda next. And talk about, as you move into that leadership and management role, the changes that will occur for you, how you see yourself, and all of these other things here. And we're going to start briefly with a poll to this section. And that poll is really to ask you, if you're an aspiring leader, what do you think is the biggest change that will come for you when you move into a manager leader position? If you've been in a manager leader position, that opportunity to reflect on the changes, as Maria did at the end of her last session, reflect on the changes that occurred for you. And we'll give folks a few minutes to provide some answers. So handling relationships with coworkers, absolutely. Particularly when you move into a manager leader role, as Maria did, of a team that you have been a colleague of in the past. So that's a significant thing to think about. The dynamics within the organization, absolutely. So the way you think about your work in the organization will change and become a bit bigger picture, potentially, as you move. Communication, with all levels. So again, you're communicating from a different place, and you will be communicating likely different things. Letting go of ego, interesting, and thank you. Keeping personal separate from work, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Knowing your blind spots. Lots about relationships with coworkers and how those things will change. More waiting to guide and not direct. So again, that's the leadership versus management, when to step in. That's a great one. We'll talk about that as well. Yeah. Relying on your own thoughts to guide you, having to become a decision maker. Absolutely. Quite often people wish they could make the decision until they are actually in the position of having to make the decision. So that's something really to think about. Absolutely. Learning to be kinder to yourself, and that we're not superheroes, for sure, for sure. Developing confidence, more autonomous decision making. Yeah, those are all absolutely things to think about. Walking in the shadow of the previous beloved leader. We'll talk a bit about legacies and what you need to think about in that respect. Yeah. Trust others to do the day-to-day management of the things that you used to do. That's a significant change for sure. Thank you. Yes. So thank you for those thoughts. We'll move into the next slide of the content. And so setting the context here, and again, you'll see the theme. This was also part of my journey in Whistler. So for the first time ever, I bungee jumped, and it was something like, in some respects, the leap into a management position when you've never done it before. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the fear of the changes and what supports you have in place to do it. So, you know, it was the process involved the triple checking of the harness that I was wearing, the people who were on the bridge talking me through it and being very supportive as I did it. And the little graph that you see there, there's a circle that was actually from my heart rate monitor, which I intended to take off when I took the jump so that it didn't fly into the river, but I did in the moment forget to take it off. And the two peaks that I have circled there were really interesting to me and something that I've really reflected on since then. The first peak, which you can see my blood pressure goes higher, my heart rate goes higher. That's actually the point in time where I stepped up to the edge and decided that I wasn't going to do it, and actually walked away from the edge and said, no, this isn't for me. And the kind people there said, well, would you like to keep the harness on and think about it for a few more minutes before you decide for sure? I said, absolutely. And a couple minutes later, I walked up to the edge, and as you can see, I made the jump. And the really interesting thing for me about that is the moment that I made the jump, my heart rate did not go near as high as it did in that moment where I walked away from the edge. So, you know, sometimes you have to make the jump. Sometimes the anticipation is worse than the actual jump. And I've heard that from leaders, sort of things that they've put off because they didn't really want to do it. It was going to be very uncomfortable. And when they finally, you know, picked up the phone and made that phone call, had that conversation, it wasn't near as bad as they thought it was going to be. But also reflecting that there's a flip side to that, which we talked about. Maria shared with us in the COVID webinar, the idea of shake, rattle, and roll after the fact. Sometimes the anxiety comes before, sometimes the anxiety comes after, and remembering that you can do it in that moment, that you can approach it with calm and do what you need to do when you're taking that leap into something that feels a bit unknown. So moving into the next part. So we have this change that occurs in professional identity. And it's something that we don't always think about when we're thinking of moving into management and leadership. And the image here is the guide that I had for my 6 weeks in Whistler, who had previously been a championship skier and came to the end of that career and realized that she needed to think about what a new career would look like. And her new career is a hiking guide, a professional executive coach, a fitness instructor, and very similarly to when you move from a frontline position into a management leadership position, you can think about as a professional skier, so much of her success was her own success. She had people who supported her in that success, but it was what she did when she was on the hill that really defined her. And she had to move into this role where what other people do, how she supports other people's success is what defines her. And on the next screen, that's what you will see related to one of the biggest changes in moving into management and leadership, is that what made you successful before, your technical skill, your technical expertise, is no longer what makes you successful as a leader and a manager. Again, your professional identity, even thinking about, when you go and meet new people, you might currently say, well, I'm an employment counselor, I'm a social worker. And that shifts. That's a different conversation now when you introduce yourself and who you are and what you do. And you may still be a social worker, but you and have that designation and have that registration, but what you do in your work every day changes, and it becomes something that you need to be able to articulate and recognize that there's a bit of a loss there if you've really identified with your previous role. You do continue to be part of the team, but different, which a number of people indicated when they were talking about, when we did the poll on what changes for you. There is a significant change in your role in the team. And how you spend and focus your time and energy changes. And we're going to dig into that one a little bit further right now. So there's just a bit of a chart here with some of the areas for you to reflect and think on what might be changing and how you can think about how you're going to do things differently in a new role. Certainly, there's more meetings when you're in a leadership and management role, but it's also the flavor of your participation in those meetings that's going to change probably fairly significantly most of the time. So you may be leading meetings now. When you're sitting in a meeting, your thoughts may be less on putting your own input into a discussion, putting your technical expertise into the discussion, and a broader focus on accomplishing the goals of the meetings, facilitating other people's input. The reason you have other people there in the meeting with you is to hear what they have to say about things, bringing their ideas together, pulling threads together. And the reality is, as a leader and manager, you often have more takeaway work from a meeting. So you have more active engagement than possibly you have in the past. And that also reflects in how you're going to spend time after the meeting. Communication, something else that people reflected on. You're communicating a bit more systemically as opposed to individually. You need to think about confidentiality in new ways, which can be, most of the people that we have on this webinar, confidentiality is part of what they currently do. In a very significant way, part of your professional practice. But as a leader and manager, there are different things that you need to think about that need to be held in confidentiality, and that need to be the way that you articulate things as far as confidentiality. It can also be challenging from the perspective of we all would strive and want to be very transparent as leaders. And sometimes there's a tension there between things that you must keep confidential and being very transparent. So thinking back into some of the conversations that you've had with leaders and managers where you know that they've been struggling to be as transparent as possible, but trying to maintain confidentiality about human resources, about decisions that have been made. It's something to reflect on how you will think about navigating that. Your area of expertise. You will still have a significant technical expertise from the area that you come from. However, when you're sharing your expertise, it's less about sharing that individual technical expertise, and it is about getting those broader factors, getting information from other people, and sharing a broader opinion or a broader perspective. Knowing how to find the folks who have technical expertise that's necessary that you might not have. So again, you bring your individual expertise to the table, but as you're making broader decisions, you want to make sure that you get the perspectives of other individuals who have other expertises. And some of you, again, may be starting out with a project, As a leader, that may be your first opportunity to manage a project. So again, your area of expertise may be the project, but again, in the context of the bigger picture. Your priorities change. In many cases, you spend less time on your daily tasks and more time coordinating longer term projects. So this is where, Maria was talking about to-do lists and calendars. And yes, we certainly don't want to be completely bound by those things, but you also want to think about how you're going to use them differently. You will need more time for working on longer term projects. So you might want to, when you are booking a meeting, for example, block some additional time after the meeting to make sure that you have time to do the things that you need to do that came out of the meeting. Look at the timelines for a project, the end goal, and work your way backwards. Make sure that you've got time blocked. And it might just take you longer to do things because you're spending time coaching others. So giving yourself room in your calendar to do that. We certainly spent a great bit of time talking about certainty in the COVID-19, so I won't spend too much more time on that when we did our previous webinar. And again, always remembering that your ability to accomplish things relies more on other people than it previously did. There's always a certain amount of teamwork. There's always a certain amount of everybody having to do their piece. As a manager and leader, the vast majority of what you accomplish is really other people's accomplishments. So making sure you're thinking about how you are going to structure your time in order to do that. And we'll move on to the next slide. So there's also a change which many of you reflected on in how others see you. And this picture really reflects that our leader in this hike that we were on, she's certainly celebrating with us, but she's not even in the picture because she's the one taking the picture. And I think that just sort of nicely captures the way that things are a bit different when you're a leader and a manager. You will celebrate with your team, but you need to think how you're supporting them and celebrating, how you're making sure that they have that opportunity to celebrate. So we'll move to the next slide. A few people mentioned the legacy of a predecessor, and that can be for better or for worse. Whatever that legacy is, I think somebody mentioned sort of a long-term beloved leader. You also may have a predecessor who set up a culture that wasn't the best culture for the team to thrive. Either way, you have some things to do to overcome that. Again, yes, you're being seen through the lens of being a manager and leader at all times. And what you do and say now reflects on the organization more than ever. So in the next slide, we will talk about that legacy that you need to think about how you're going to overcome. Sometimes as well, it's overcoming the legacy of you as a team member and making that shift into you as a leader. So the first thing to know is that when you step into a new position, whether you're a seasoned leader stepping into a new position or somebody who's a manager or a leader for the first time, know that it's not about you. Some of the pushback that you're getting when you're sort of hearing stories about that's not the way the last person used to do things, that's about the change. It's not reflective on necessarily whether you're doing things right or wrong. It's people struggling with the change. It's people working their way through their emotions and coming to a new place with you. And one of the ways that you can fairly early on, particularly if you're moving into a new organization, you can start to work with that is you establish your credibility. And that's not about boasting, and that's not about emailing everybody your CV, but it is telling your story and talking to people about where you come from, the skills that you have, where you know that you're going to be looking to them as experts to support you in things. So starting that conversation about letting them know what you're all about and where you come from. And that includes your style and your expectations. Recognizing that people may not, in the early days, completely meet those expectations once you've articulated them. And part of it may be, the last leader talked a good talk, but then never held us accountable. So they're used to things a certain way. You're setting up new expectations, and they really want to know if those expectations are true or if there's something else that you expect from them that you're not articulating. And that's why when your expectations aren't met, the first thing you want to do is really seek to understand. Is this somebody who is has challenging behaviors on an ongoing basis? Is this somebody that's really struggling to understand new expectations? Be very clear and consistent about what you expect. People will test boundaries, as Maria talked about her experience. You know, when you have a new leader, a new manager, if there are decisions that have been made in the past that people don't like, they will come to you and sort of test, does that decision still stand? If you set expectations that aren't what people are used to, they will push and test, sometimes very subconsciously, not purposefully trying to make your life difficult, but they're really trying to find their way and how this new team with this new leader fits together. So you want to make sure you're walking the talk. You want to make sure that you are consistent. You welcome feedback from people. It's an opportunity to both hear what isn't working for people and also an opportunity to reinforce your expectations. So somebody might say, you know, you asked us to do this, but I wasn't sure it's what you wanted us to do. And you can respond, no, when I ask you to do something, you can be sure that that is what I expect. There's no hidden agenda, whatever the case may be. And being human, of course, with all the messiness that entails. As you're sort of drinking from the fire hose in a new position, you're learning all of these new things. There will be moments where you aren't as consistent as you wanted to be. Take that moment, go back to the individual and say, you know, that conversation didn't feel right to me. Can we try it again? Can we have can we reframe this a little bit? Something that I always like to share is the idea of that it's okay as a manager and a leader to apologize, which 20 years ago was sort of not part of the management and leadership models that we were learning about. And certainly even just in the world in general, 20 years ago, a lawyer would tell you never to apologize, that once you apologize, that means that you're accepting liability. That means that you could be sued for something. Organizations were told, do not apologize. And in the mid to late 90s, Canada actually implemented legislation called the Apologies Act. And the purpose of that legislation was to say it is okay to apologize for things. Your apology cannot be held against you as far as bringing liability or attracting liability to you. They recognize that as human beings, we need to do that. And the example that I have that really brought that forward for me was when I was on the quality committee at St. Joseph's Healthcare in London. And we were talking about complaints that had been received and how many of those turned over into lawsuits. And it was noted that since the organization had been allowed by their lawyers to start to apologize for things, that fewer and fewer lawsuits were happening because they were able to make that human connection with people to say, yes, this was an error. Here's what we're going to do differently next time. And people felt satisfied with that and didn't sort of feel that frustration of needing to go to a lawsuit. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this slide talks about how you communicate as a leader. And in this visual, you will see our leader in her rain gear as we are all hiking through the rain. And she's giving us a thumbs up, even though that may not be exactly how she's feeling hiking through the rain. And I'm not saying don't be authentic and don't be true to yourself. But remembering that whatever it is that you're communicating, whatever it is that you're getting back when you're communicating, that it's not about you, it is about the broader organization, it is about the team and what you're accomplishing. And something that's really difficult for new leaders and managers is how do you communicate a decision that you don't agree with? Remembering you're representing the organization. Remembering that staff need to maintain confidence in you. Confidence in the organization at large, and that at some point in the future you're going to need to enforce these decisions. And it can be very tricky if you have shared a decision and say, you know, I don't agree with this, but this is what we have to do. And then later on, somebody doesn't follow through and you have to turn around and try and enforce and say, no, that is exactly what we have to do. And the person looks at you and says, well, but you don't agree with it either. So remember all those things as you're deciding how you're going to communicate. And there's different ways of saying it. There's some examples here. You don't have to, again, sort of pretend walk around with your thumbs up all the time. You can acknowledge that there's difficult decisions to be made, that there's two sides, pros and cons to decisions. And an example that I learned from a team of leaders is that they would support each other. When there was a decision that one of them was really struggling with, they'd sit down with the rest of the group and say, okay, help me talk through how I'm going to communicate this in a really positive way. And we'll talk a bit about support networks as well. So we'll move to the next slide. And this is about how you see others. So just as your previous team will see you differently when you move into a management and leadership position, you will also start to see them differently in some cases. And this is my tongue-in-cheek picture here. Is it's a lot of fun to go out kayaking with a dog until the dog is actually in your kayak and trying to jump out to go after a duck. So you may find colleagues that you previously didn't connect very well with. You didn't understand what they did. They were kind of removed and just had their head down doing their work. As a leader or a manager, you have a different view on them, and you realize that they are really strong and really skilled at what it is that they are doing. And just because they're not the most fun person in the group, you just get that different, and vice versa. You may find that a colleague that you used to find a lot of fun, somebody who would sort of brighten up the day, has some challenges that you need to support them with as a leader or manager that's just very different than the perspective that you used to have of them. And the next slide talks a little bit more about some of those changes. We're going to dive a bit into giving feedback. It's something when you haven't been a leader or manager, you will have had some opportunity to do, I'm sure, and depending on your role, it may have been part of your role. Some roles, some frontline roles, the only time they give feedback is if their organization does a 360 performance review for other people, and that's your only exposure to it. So, and this feedback is just a key component of what you are doing as a leader and a manager. You must walk towards conflict. So again, as a frontline staff member, if you saw conflict happening somewhere else on the team, often the best approach was to stay away from it, to stay out of it, to let that conflict be resolved by others. As a leader or a manager, you are the other who needs to step towards that conflict and resolve it to support the team and empower the team. And you need to determine the best approach to support other people's success. So let's talk a little bit about feedback. And you'll be getting some resources that have even more tips on giving feedback. Our short version here is just a few things to remember about giving feedback. To be kind. And that means that sometimes if you're frustrated with somebody's behavior in the moment, you need to step away and take a bit of a deep breath before you navigate it. Addressing people's behavior instead of addressing an individual as sort of what they are. No, it's about what their behavior was. An example of this that I have is having a staff member move to my department from a different department who was expected to arrive at work on their first day at 8 a.m. and they showed up at 8:45. And I went through all of these, first of all, are they okay? Did something happen to them? And then sort of that frustration, like on the first day, they're late, they haven't called me. Is this what I'm going to expect going forward? And sort of walking into that conversation with part of me wanting to just be very, very firm about, that you were expected at 8 a.m., what happened? And the other part of me that said, okay, let's understand what happened. And when I asked the question, discovering that their previous supervisor had asked them to show up at their old position for the first half an hour just to help make sure that the person that was replacing them was well oriented, and it was actually their supervisor who didn't communicate with me. So they had, they thought that it had all been organized, and had I gone in with guns blazing, that would have set up the relationship from our very first interaction fairly negatively. So it's a good opportunity to understand the behavior, and then being clear and being kind doesn't mean beating around the bush. Because if you both walk out of the conversation with a different understanding of what the conversation was about, then you're going to have to address the behavior again, and they're not even going to know what they've done wrong. So being very clear about what it is that you're addressing. Make sure you're taking an opportunity to discuss the solutions, to be constructive. What can you do to help them as you're giving them this feedback? And then following up is critical. Address the issue if it comes up again, particularly if it is something that becomes a pattern. If you address it once and then you let it slide the next couple of times, you're kind of starting from scratch again the next time you address it. And that inconsistency makes people unclear on what your expectations are. You were okay when I did it last time, but you're not okay when I did it this time. And of course, taking those moments to provide positive feedback when you do see somebody really making a difference, to take your feedback on board and do something with it. So we're going to do another quick poll. Maria will move us to that software. And just want you to take a few minutes and reflect either on these 4 points or other things that you have experienced when you're giving feedback or thinking about giving feedback, and what is the most challenging part for you? So we can see as people are answering that, yes, sometimes in that moment of wanting to be very clear on policy, wanting to be very clear, and that sometimes being kind, you have to take that moment, you have to take that step back to ask some questions and really understand what's happening. Being clear, yeah, so everybody has sort of different challenges with what they need to work on as they think about how they give feedback, and just an opportunity to reflect. When you give feedback after the fact, take a few moments to reflect on what worked about it and what you could have done differently. For those of you in the Be Constructive, how can you be more constructive in supporting people with coming up with their own solutions, making suggestions yourself about what to do differently? So thank you very much for participating in the poll. And as we move on to the next slide, we introduced this idea of situational leadership in the COVID-19 webinar, and we promised that we would dive into a little bit deeper, and that's what we're going to do here today. So situational leadership is really about giving people what they need in the moment that they need it, recognizing that any individual can need directing at one point in time and delegating at another point in time. The situation and where the person is at related to that situation helps guide you as you pick what tools you're going to pull out of your toolkit to support that individual. So we'll start at the bottom right. And again, we talked about COVID-19 often being a place where you need to move into a directing mode. And directing is really about the person is eager to do the task. They have no idea, it's a brand new task to them. They have no idea what it is that you're asking them to do. They're motivated, but they just don't have that experience. So you're directing, you're being very, very clear about what the task is and the steps that you want them to take. You're building their competence in the task. So you're not doing a whole lot of coaching here. You're obviously providing positive reinforcement as things go well, positive feedback, but you're giving them a really safe place to try out something new by telling them exactly what it is that they are doing. Once they've developed some competence, you move into a bit more of a coaching. So you're still have that really strong safety net about directing them what to do. But as you talk to them about what to do, you might provide more opportunities for them to think about it for themselves. So what step might you think about taking next? Or do you understand why I'm asking you to take this step next? It's a lot more dialogue happening in coaching, as you can see the places that they're frustrated, the places that are going really well, supporting them in that, in the way that they need it. And then again, they continue to develop competence in this particular task. The next time you ask them to do it, you're moving much more into supporting role. You're not telling them as much about what to do. You're developing their confidence. You're asking more of those questions. Okay, what step are you going to take next? Give them the opportunity to describe it. Do a little bit of talking about why that makes sense, that yes, that's the right thing to do. Absolutely, go ahead and take that step. Or ask questions. Did you think about this aspect? Did you think about that aspect? So you're moving them into a much more comfortable place, but still having that safety net there. They can check in with you and you're checking in with them, which then takes you to the delegating. Somebody who's really competent in a particular task or activity, somebody who also has a really high confidence level because they've moved through this development stages in that activity. You're really setting the outcome, telling them what needs to be accomplished, and then sending them on their way. This is somebody that you know that when they need advice, they will come to you, that they won't get themselves into a situation where they're sort of over their heads, that they will approach and ask for what they need. And this model by Hersey and Blanchard has been around for quite a long time, and is actually the model that made me decide that this direction of working in organizations and leadership and management was really kind of a cool thing that I wanted to find out more about and move into. So we'll move to the next slide. And here's the next thing that's going to change for you. And it's a change in the influence that you have. And as a result of that influence, the approach that you're going to take to particular things. So what changes here, and I've mentioned this before, but it really is critical when you're a leader and a manager to recognize that you need to shift your perspective in some respects related to this, that your role is about empowering others. You are successful when others are empowered. And again, some of you, the frontline roles that you have, you're empowering clients, you're empowering patients. This is about empowering your team members and the people that you work with. Some of you, particularly folks who first get into leadership and management roles, end up having a dual role. They may be a part-time leader and part-time still working in their frontline position. And your leadership role needs to influence how you work in your frontline position. Even though you are not a full-time leader, you are a full-time leader in that when people look at you, they know you're a leader and how you carry yourself. They know you're a manager, and how you carry yourself will impact how they see you and will impact your ability to influence in the future. And of course, leading with empathy and connectedness that we've talked about a great deal in COVID, and recognizing that that's different from friendship. And clearly a lot of you have recognized that in our first poll in this portion of the webinar, when it came up loud and clear that that change in how you navigate and work with the people that you previously worked with as a colleague. And we'll move to the next slide. So we want to talk a little bit here about relational leadership, and knowing that the industries that you are in, the organizations that we work with at CfOE are very much relational organizations. And there's a definition there you can see of relational leadership, people accomplishing change in order to benefit the common good and the community, and that the process that you use in relational leadership is deeply focused on building and cultivating those relationships. And as we recognized again in the previous webinar today, that a formal leadership position is not required in order to practice these things. The other thing that I will mention is that relational leadership has really become more of a philosophy or a practice than a model. So the model I'm sharing with you today has 5 aspects to relational leadership. If you go to the literature, you'll see that there are some that talk about 7 aspects, some talk about 3 aspects. It really is about that process of cultivating relationships within your organization, with your partner organizations. And I'll start at the top, those relationships that are purposeful. So relationships that understand change, that you're doing things from a shared purpose, shared values. Again, not necessarily about process of the individual things that you are doing together, but what are you trying to accomplish together. Inclusive, so a relational leader is aware of themselves, their strengths, the places that they need to work on, aware of others, and that others are coming from different places, different perspectives, have different stories that will be impacting how they develop those relationships with them. A relational leader values diversity. Diversity as well in skill set, diversity in what technical skills people bring to the table. And something that I've always said is if you're in a meeting and everybody in the meeting agrees on something vehemently, then you probably didn't need the meeting and you don't need everybody in the room. You bring people together to get different perspectives and diversity. A relational leader empowers. So again, understanding powers and understanding practices that you can use that will inhibit people being empowered for themselves or that will promote people be empowered for themselves. And you'll be learning some of these things as we go through the rest of the webinar, some of those practices that you can use. And then it's process oriented. And as I mentioned under purposeful, this isn't process necessarily related to how I get from point A to point B to point C, which is part of your management and you do need to do. But when you're thinking about it from the perspective of a relational leadership, you're thinking about the process of relationships, the processes of groups, how groups work together, how you empower groups to be more successful working together, the dynamics of a group and a community and how they come together. And a relational leader is ethical. So relational leadership is built around organizations like the organizations that you are all in who have a commitment to social responsibility. A relational leader has integrity, authenticity, and develops trust. And moving on to our next slide. The other thing that changes, and this has been a little bit of a theme, and again, is something that many of you brought up, is relationship with team members, the people who have, your colleagues who have been your network of support, likely, before you were in a formal management position, how you need to navigate those things a little bit differently, how you need to develop networks of support that will work with you. So we go back to my bungee jump because that was quite an accomplishment for me. And the image here really is about taking that leap and the networks of support that I had there. So, you know, on the bridge with the harness that 3 or 4 people checked before I got to the edge of the bridge. You can see the gentleman there who was talking me to the edge and talking me through taking that step off of it. And everybody needs that. Everybody needs networks of support professionally to help navigate those challenging times, to bounce ideas off of. So we will move to the next slide. So you do need to realign expectations of previous colleagues, and that's a gentle, but again, very firm and being very consistent about that. One of the things that's key, again, that we talked about a little bit earlier, is you can no longer be, as a manager leader, you can no longer be a passive recipient of complaints. So you can think about, you know, sitting in the lunchroom and talking about a process that isn't working for you and just kind of with your colleagues expressing frustration and that kind of thing. You can't really sit in that conversation anymore and to just sit in that conversation. When you hear complaints, you have to think about what it is that you're going to be doing with those complaints. How are you going to reflect on them? And that might make it difficult to sit in those conversations in the same way that you used to. So talking to people about what needs to be different about that. And again, seeking out your new opportunities to develop supportive relationships. So the next slide that we'll go to just has a few more examples of some of the expectations that you need to realign for yourself and for your colleagues about and how you navigate some of these things. So friendships in the workplace. Friendships that you had with colleagues, thinking about people who now report to you. You really need to think about some of the implications of how you navigate your relationships with people. Somebody who reports to you When you are their manager and leader, you want to be connected, you want to be empathetic, you want to make gestures that are akin to friendship gestures. However, there are some fundamental differences between a friendship that is solely a friendship and this connected, empathetic, leaderful relationship that you have with people. One of those things is that there is a change in balance of power. So again, we talked about how people look at you and how you look at them. In a friendship that is solely a friendship, it's really a level playing field, and there are elements here that it's definitely not a level playing field as far as the balance of power. You need to think about how other people will look upon those friendships. So if you have somebody in your team that you are connecting with more, how does that play out for the whole team dynamic? How do other people sort of feel about that, and do they feel left out? Confidentiality, again, when you have somebody that you're a friend with, you share any number of things, and there are certain things that you cannot share with people, even though you want to work with empathy and connectedness. And of course, your legal responsibility to the organization. You never want to end up in a position where you have developed a friendship with somebody that is in conflict with what you need to do as a leader and a manager, put either of you in that position. So the connectedness, the empathy that you have as a leader and a manager is very different than what you have in a friendship. Again, something else that you need to talk to people about is complaints. And something that I think a lot of leaders at some point run into in their career is somebody coming to them with a complaint and opening the conversation with, I want to tell you about an issue, but I need it to be confidential. And again, many of you have dealt with confidentiality in many, many ways in your roles already, but it's really important to recognize that you cannot commit to confidentiality with a staff member who's bringing something to you until after you've heard the thing. So there are things that they will bring to you that they want to be held in confidence for any number of reasons, and you cannot commit to that confidentiality. They have a responsibility. If there's an issue in the organization that needs to be addressed, they have a responsibility to bring it forward. You have a responsibility to hear that issue and then make a decision how you're going to navigate it. Hopefully, many of your organizations have some policies around when people make complaints and confidentiality. You can assure people that you will, to the best of your ability, keep things confidential depending on the issue. Sometimes you can ask about why they want confidentiality, and I've often heard the concern is about reprisals. And again, hopefully your organization has a policy about that. You can reassure people that your organization does not stand for reprisals, and if that becomes an issue, then that's something that will need to be dealt with. When you hear complaints as well, that doesn't always mean that you have to jump in and resolve it. Sometimes somebody's coming to you because they want to have a conversation with somebody about an issue and they don't know how to do it. So you can support them to do their own problem solving to resolve the issue, but you need to start to learn how to recognize when something needs to be escalated and when something can be left to the person to resolve. That's a risk management issue that you may have information that the person doesn't have. So a person may be complaining about somebody who has a particular behavior, and they don't want you to do anything about it because it was the first time that it happened and it made them, uneasy about a policy being broken, but they don't think it's happened very often. But you might actually know that it's happened more than once. You may have had other people come to you. So again, you've got some confidentiality things there, and you need to be able to make the decision to escalate. People will ask you for information that you can't share. And it's often comes from a good place. Somebody is suddenly off for 2 weeks and people want to know if they're okay. And as a leader or manager, the person may have told you what's happening, but of course, unless they give you permission, you can't explain that to anybody. So you have information you can't share with people. When you were their colleague, if they told you, it was different. Now that you're the manager, when they tell you, unless you make it clear that they're okay with you sharing, it's not yours to share. So you can say to people, I can't answer that question. It puts me in a difficult position when you ask, because it's not mine to share. And be very aware of people playing what I call the guessing game. So all of us can think about sort of a news conference where you just hear somebody saying over and over again, I can't confirm or deny. And it can be easy to get trapped into denying things that aren't true when people are guessing. And then it comes to the point where they say something that is true and you can't say anything without lying. And if you've been denying everything else, you've essentially confirmed the thing. So just be very careful, thinking about being, again, very consistent about how you respond to that. You do need a confidant, you do need support, networks of support. The other thing to think about, if your previous colleagues, if there's somebody who used to be your confidant who's on the team and you're sharing things with them now, they do have that leader manager hat on you when you're talking to them, and they may start to wonder what you're sharing with other people. So, and setting up a team member to be your confidant can damage the relationship if you need to have a challenging conversation with them later. And an example of that, I know a leader that I worked with had done exactly that. A team member who was in a helping profession, who was very seasoned and very senior, and she started using him as a bit of a sounding board for things. And then a policy came up that he wasn't following, that she had to address with him. And he was quite offended, and more offended than perhaps he would have been if they hadn't already had that relationship. And it was very uncomfortable for both of them. It was more uncomfortable for her than she thought it should have been. And she had to spend some time both repairing and reframing that. So take some time to cultivate productive relationships with your new management colleagues. Look outside of your organization as well as within your organization. Find those networks of people who are experiencing the same things that you are experiencing, that have a similar perspective as far as some of the challenges of leadership and management. And of course, most importantly, the person that you report to. That's your place that you're going to hopefully have the strongest supportive relationship. People will challenge your decision, and as I talked about earlier, that idea of boundary testing, shifting, that sometimes when you're talking about technical things, you can defend your position because it's about data and it's about evidence. And when you're talking about decisions that have pros and cons, you don't want to be shifted into a place of defending your decision. You want to explain why the decision was made. So there's a bit of a nuance there, and it takes some practice. And don't commit to changing the decision. You can commit to listening. You can commit to getting more information. Don't commit to changing the decision until you're absolutely sure that that's the right thing to do. And it's rarely the right thing to do just because one person has challenged you. And again, people will test boundaries for any number of reasons, and even subconsciously they may be testing boundaries. Be as consistent as you can, and when you slip up, acknowledge it. Don't be afraid to revisit a conversation and say, you know, I'm not sure we ended up in the right place there. Can we just have a quick chat about it again? So we'll move to our next slide. Where I really want to wrap up, because this may have felt very heavy about all of the different things that you have to think about that are going to be different for you. And remember, if you spent some time and you've done the work that Maria has spoken to you about in the first hour of the webinar, your why stays the same. And that's why it's so valuable to have it. You can ground in that. My image here that really reflects that for me is I had not spent more than a half a dozen times on a bicycle since I was a teenager until I went out to Whistler. And I went out to Whistler to get into nature, to enjoy the scenery, to develop new networks of people who were interested in different things. And some of the things that we were hiking, we were kayaking, very comfortable with that. Not so comfortable on a bike, but we spent some time on a bike, and I discovered actually a real joy of biking. And that is something that I've added to my repertoire of things that I do now. And again, as you move into something like leadership and management, you know, my why, the reason I get on a bike is the same reason that I get into a kayak, but it's a new means of getting there. It's a new means of getting to my why, and hopefully leadership and management will do that for you. So as we spend just a couple minutes wrapping up, there will be 3 reflection questions for those of you who are doing the certificate. It's the same strategy as Maria articulated previously, in that maximum 3 pages double spaced for the total. So a page of questions. Some of these pages might only take some of these questions might only take half a page, but please maximize at 3 pages in total. And for those of you who aren't taking the certificate, hopefully it's an opportunity to just spend some quiet time when you can to reflect on these on your own. So your legacy as a leader in your organization, we talked about that you will have to navigate other people's legacies. What do you want your legacy to be when you leave an organization, when you leave a team? Similar to the reflection that Maria talked about, thinking about your 80th birthday. This is a little bit more focused on the organization. What do you need to do to strengthen your networks of support and ensure that you have appropriate networks of support when you move into that management leadership position? What are some of the strategies that you can use? And going back to how critical feedback is as a manager and leader, and that some of you, most of you sort of responded to our poll and recognize that there are areas that are more challenging for you than others. So spend a little bit of time thinking about how you can actively develop some of those skills. What are the things that you're going to do to put it into practice? And so we will close our webinar, moving back into a poll. Before we do that, just to make sure that you know that, again, you'll get an email following the webinar. We'll be asking you for some feedback, and we hope that you will provide it to us. Those reflective practice questions, you'll be getting, those of you who are doing the certificate, you'll get a link to complete those reflective practice questions, and we ask you to complete them before the next webinar. And then everybody, regardless of whether or not you're doing the certificate, will get a link and a password to the recorded webinar and all of the resources that we've talked about. So we'll move to the poll, and we'll use the same poll that we did in the COVID-19 as everybody checks out and moves on with the rest of their afternoon. Really, how are you feeling as you're leaving our 2-hour session today? Thank you for dedicating the time to spend with us. We very much appreciate it and hope that this has been a valuable opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is about communication skills as a leader and manager. Thank you.